Now she is dead, we have everything to ourselves.
We are millionaires.
There's a specific kind of silence that falls over a hospital room when a doctor stops pretending everything is going to be okay. It's not the silence of peace. It's not the silence of rest. It's the silence of a verdict. And in room 412 of Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles, California, that silence lasted exactly 4 seconds before a man named Ethan Calloway did something that no one in that hallway would ever forget. He smiled. Not the relieved smile of a frightened husband finally exhaling. Not the grateful smile of a man who had just survived the worst night of his life. A different kind of smile. The kind that lives behind a man's eyes for years before it finally escapes. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because before you can understand what happened in that hospital room, you need to understand what Amelia Thompson gave up to put that man in it. You need to understand what real sacrifice looks like. And you need to understand why some betrayals don't just break a heart, they rewrite an entire life. If you've ever seen a family like the Thompsons from the outside, you probably assumed their happiness was decorative. The kind of happiness that exists for photographs and charity galas and holiday cards mailed to people you barely know. You would have been wrong. Victor Thompson, founder of Thompson Capital Group, one of the most powerful private equity firms in California, was genuinely in love with his wife of 31 years. He built his empire not to impress the world, but to give his daughter a life without ceilings. He was the kind of man who still opened car doors, still called home when he landed from business trips, still remembered the name of every person who had ever worked in his house. And his daughter Amelia? Amelia was the best of both of them. She had her father's instincts, that rare ability to read a room, read a person, read a situation before anyone else had finished forming their first impression. And she had her mother's heart, unguarded, generous to the point of danger. She grew up in a Bel Air estate with 12 bedrooms and a view of the canyon that made grown men go quiet. She attended Westridge, then Columbia, then returned to Los Angeles with an MBA and a genuine desire to do something meaningful with the privilege she'd been handed. She wasn't spoiled. That's the important part. She knew exactly what she had and exactly how rare it was, and it made her more careful with people, not less. It made her want to give, which is precisely why, at 29 years old, at a charity fundraiser for underserved youth programs in South Los Angeles, when she met a man who was working the event as part of catering staff, she didn't look away. Most women in her position would have. Amelia Thompson looked directly at him and smiled first. His name was Ethan Calloway. He was 27, from Inglewood, good-looking in a specific way that makes people overlook things they should notice. Strong jaw, easy laugh, the kind of effortless charm that reads as confidence until you've known someone long enough to understand it's actually performance. He was smart. That part was real. Sharp enough to recognize the moment he was standing in. Sharp enough to know that the woman smiling at him across a room full of wealth was not just beautiful. She was an opportunity. Whether he knew that consciously in that moment is the kind of question only Ethan Calloway can answer. What we know is what he did. He crossed the room. He made her laugh. He asked thoughtful questions and listened like she was the most interesting person he'd ever spoken to. Because she was, and because he was smart enough to show it. By the end of the evening, she had his number. By the following weekend, they had dinner. By the end of the month, Amelia Thompson was in something she hadn't been in a long time. She was falling. Victor Thompson knew, within the first handshake, he had spent 30 years evaluating people for a living, figuring out within minutes whether someone had the character to match their ambition, whether their confidence was built on substance or just well-practiced nerve. He'd made billion-dollar decisions based on that instinct and been right enough times to trust it completely. When Amelia brought Ethan home for the first time, Victor shook his hand, looked him in the eyes, and felt something cold move through him. He didn't say it immediately. He was a careful man. He watched. He watched the way Ethan's eyes move around the Bel Air estate, cataloging, assessing, calculating in a way that he tried to disguise as wonder. He watched the way Ethan spoke about his ambitions, always adjacent to Amelia's resources, always framed as potential waiting for the right opportunity. He watched the way Ethan touched his daughter, possessively in public, distantly when he thought no one was watching. By the third visit, Victor sat his daughter down. "He's only after your money," he said. Not cruelly. Quietly. The way a man speaks when he hopes he's wrong and knows he isn't. Amelia didn't get angry. She got quiet in the way she always got quiet when she'd already made a decision and was simply waiting for everyone else to finish objecting. "I know what you think you see, Dad," she said, "but you're wrong about him." Victor didn't push. He loved his daughter too much to make her choose. He simply said, "I hope I am," and meant it more than she knew. Her sister-in-law, Diane, married to Amelia's older brother Conrad, was less diplomatic. Diane had never particularly liked Amelia's ease with people, the way rooms shifted toward her without effort. And she liked even less the idea of an outsider entering the family's orbit under circumstances she considered suspect. "He's a catering employee." "Amelia, I'm not being cruel, I'm being honest. What does he actually want?" "The same thing anyone wants," Amelia said, and smiled and changed the subject. Her closest friend, Priya Mehta, they'd been inseparable since Columbia, two sharp-minded women who had dragged each other through every difficult season of their 20s, was the most specific in her concern. "I'm not saying he's a bad person," Priya told her over lunch at Noble one afternoon. "I'm saying I've watched him with you for 4 months, and I've never once seen him look at you the way you look at him. That's not nothing, Ami." Amelia was quiet for a moment. "Maybe he just shows it differently," she said. Priya looked at her best friend, brilliant, warm, perceptive about everything in the world except, apparently, this, and didn't say what she was thinking. She would think about that lunch for a long time afterward. And then there was Ethan's mother. Loretta Calloway was a woman who had spent decades watching the world hand things to other people and had developed a very specific philosophy about what her son was owed by the universe. She arrived at Amelia's life like a conclusion that had been waiting to be drawn, warm, effusive, instantly affectionate in a way that felt like an embrace and functioned like a net. "You are exactly what this family needed," Loretta told Amelia, holding both her hands at their first meeting, eyes shining. She wasn't wrong. She just meant it differently than she sounded. Loretta pushed the engagement before Ethan did. Called it destiny. Called it God's plan. Told anyone who would listen that her son had found his blessing. She attended every dinner, angled for every introduction, and ensured that Amelia understood, gently and persistently, that marrying Ethan meant taking on the full weight of the Calloway family's needs. Amelia, who had grown up with everything, felt something she rarely felt around people. Needed. It was the most dangerous thing Loretta could have given her. They married 14 months after they met. The wedding was held at the Rosewood Miramar in Montecito. Ocean views, 250 guests, string quartet, flowers that cost more than most people's yearly rent. It was a kind of wedding that appears in society pages not because anyone submitted it, but because it was impossible to ignore. Victor Thompson walked his daughter down the aisle with his jaw set in a particular way that people who didn't know him might have read as pride. The people who knew him understood it was grief held carefully in place. Ethan Calloway, standing at the altar in a suit that Amelia had quietly paid for, watched her walk toward him and felt something real. Maybe it was love. Maybe it was a particular electricity of a plan coming together exactly as planned. Maybe, in that moment, there was no difference. He said his vows with perfect conviction. He meant enough of them to make everything that followed so much worse. In the first year of their marriage, Amelia Thompson Calloway remade a man's life from the ground up. She had a conversation with her father, the kind of conversation that cost her something, because she knew what she was asking, and she knew what it communicated about her faith in her own judgment. Victor listened, said nothing for a long moment, then picked up his phone and made 2 calls. Within 3 weeks, Ethan Calloway had a senior position in the business development division of Thompson Capital Group. The salary alone was more than he'd earned in the previous 5 years combined. Amelia bought them a home in Pacific Palisades. 4 bedrooms, chef's kitchen, saltwater pool, a view of the Pacific that changed color today like something alive. She paid cash. She paid off his mother's debt, credit cards, a lapsed car note, back rent on a storage unit, where Loretta kept things she described as precious. She did it without being asked. She did it without telling him she'd done it, because she didn't want him to feel embarrassed. He found out anyway. He said thank you in a particular way people say thank you when they've already decided something is owed. She bought him a car. She funded his mother's new apartment in Inglewood. She introduced him to her family's network of connections, investors, executives, board members, people who could open rooms that most people never found the door to. She did all of this because she loved him. And she did all of this because somewhere beneath the love was a quiet, unnamed hope that if she gave enough, the thing she sometimes saw in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking would eventually be replaced by something warmer. Priya watched all of it and said less and less. The receipts were in the inside pocket of his jacket. Amelia found them on a Tuesday afternoon in March, the kind of ordinary afternoon that exists only to deliver extraordinary things. She was hanging the jacket in the closet when they fell from the pocket. 2 receipts from the Hotel Bel Air, both dated within the last 3 weeks. Room service for 2. A bottle of wine that cost $400. She stood in the closet for a very long time. Then she sat on the edge of their bed in the Pacific Palisades house she had bought for them, and she looked at the receipts, and she counted backward to the last 3 weeks, and she remembered the late nights and the work dinners and the conference in San Diego that she now understood had lasted exactly 1 night instead of 3. She thought about what Priya had said over lunch at Nobu. She thought about what her father had said in the quiet of his study. She thought about the way Loretta had looked at her at Christmas. Warm, satisfied, the look of a woman whose plan was proceeding exactly on schedule. And then she put the receipts on the kitchen counter, and she waited for her husband to come home. He walked through the door at 8:47. She heard him in the entryway, heard the casual sound of a man arriving home without guilt. Keys on the hook, shoes off. The particular ease of someone who believed the world in his house was arranged exactly as he'd left it. He walked into the kitchen and saw the receipts on the counter and went very still. "Who is she, Ethan?" The question came out steadier than she expected. She was grateful for that. What happened next was something Amelia would turn over in her mind many times in the months that followed. Not because it surprised her. She was too intelligent to be fully surprised. But because of the quality of it, the fluency of it, the way he moved through it like a man who had rehearsed for a performance he'd always known was coming. He didn't deflect. He didn't get angry. He didn't manufacture outrage at the accusation. He broke, or he performed breaking with a precision that made the difference academic. His eyes filled. He crossed the kitchen, and he took her hands, and he went down to his knees on the tile floor of the house she had paid for, and he looked up at her with an expression of such complete devastation that something in her chest moved despite everything she was trying to hold in place. He spoke for 20 minutes. He confessed everything. A secretary named Rachel, 3 months, a moment of weakness that became a pattern he was ashamed of, that he hated himself for, that he knew she deserved so much better than. He said he had been afraid of how much she'd given him. He said he'd felt unworthy and had done the most destructive thing a frightened man can do. He said he would do anything. He said he would quit. He would change. He would be who she deserved. And then, and this was the part that worked, he placed both hands on her stomach. She was 11 weeks pregnant. They had found out together in the ultrasound room at Cedars-Sinai when the technician had gone very quiet and then said, with careful professional composure, that she was counting 3 heartbeats. Triplets. "I swear on their lives," Ethan said, his voice breaking precisely. "I swear on these 3 lives. Never again. I promise you. Never again." Amelia looked down at her husband kneeling on the floor. She thought about 3 heartbeats. She thought about what her father would say. She thought about what the woman who loved this man would want, and what the woman who was about to raise his children needed to believe. She told him she forgave him, and she meant it, and she was wrong. The affair with Rachel Voss didn't end. It paused. It rearranged itself. It became more careful, more strategic, more insulated from discovery by a man who had just learned precisely how much he could get away with, and exactly what tools worked best when the walls closed in. Rachel Voss was 24, a junior executive assistant at Thompson Capital who had been quietly moved into Ethan's orbit through a departmental reassignment 6 months after his hire. She was not naive. She knew exactly who Ethan was married to and exactly what that marriage represented. She chose her position with open eyes. What she told herself about it was her own business. What she did with that position would eventually become everyone's. Amelia moved through her pregnancy the way she moved through everything. with competence and warmth and a private core hope that she tended carefully, even when the evidence around it was becoming harder to ignore. She set up the nursery herself, mostly 3 cribs positioned like a conversation, soft yellow walls, a mural of the California coast that she'd commissioned from a local artist, all muted blues and quiet shoreline. She would sit in the glider by the window on weekend mornings with her hands on her stomach and talk to them, softly, about ordinary things. The color of the canyon at sunset, the way the ocean sounded different in winter, the things she was going to show them about the world. She was going to be a magnificent mother. Ethan, in those same months, was increasingly absent in the specific way that men are absent when they successfully renegotiate the terms of their guilt. He came home. He attended the appointments he was required to attend. He performed the role with sufficient fidelity that Amelia's hope, that careful private thing, survived. But he was late, often. He was dismissive when she was tired, when she was uncomfortable, when the weight of carrying 3 lives inside her body moved across her face. He said words like overreacting and hormones in the tone of a man who has found a useful key and uses it whenever a door presents itself. Priya, who had watched all of this, said nothing. She was waiting for her moment. She didn't know yet what shape it would take. The morning Amelia went into labor was a Thursday in late November. The pain woke her at 4 a.m. Not the preliminary discomfort she'd been told to expect, but something immediate and serious. Her body making a decision with the urgency of something long overdue. She reached for her phone. She called Ethan. He answered on the 4th ring with the voice of a man who had not been asleep. "It's time," she said. "Ethan, it's time. I need you to." "I'm not nearby," he said. The terseness of it, the flatness. "Drive yourself or call someone. I'm not your maid." He hung up. Amelia sat on the edge of their bed in the dark Pacific Palisade house and breathed through a contraction and did not cry. She picked up her phone and called her neighbor, Deborah, who was 63 and retired, and had told Amelia 6 months ago, pressing her phone number into Amelia's palm like something sacred. "You call me, whatever time. You call me first." Deborah arrived in 7 minutes. She helped Amelia to the car. She drove 15 miles above the speed limit the entire way to Cedars-Sinai. She held Amelia's hand in the elevator. Amelia Thompson Calloway was admitted at 4:41 in the morning. Her husband arrived at the hospital at 9:15. He was not alone. There is a moment in every carefully constructed lie when the architect makes one fatal mistake. Not a careless mistake. Not the kind that comes from stupidity. The kind that comes from confidence. From believing after months of successful deception that you have become smarter than the truth, that you have outrun it so completely and for so long that it has simply given up chasing you. Ethan Calloway made that mistake at 9:17 in the morning on a Thursday in November, when he walked through the automatic doors of Cedars-Sinai Medical Center with Rachel Voss 2 steps behind him and didn't even think to ask her to wait outside. That was the moment. That single, arrogant, irreversible moment. And by the time he understood what it had cost him, understanding it would be the least of his problems. The delivery had been everything the doctors had warned them it might be. 3 babies, 36 weeks, a labor that moved fast in some places and stalled in others, the kind that keeps an entire team on their feet and speaking in the clipped, efficient language of controlled urgency. Amelia had been extraordinary through it. Present, focused, breathing through each wave with the particular composure of a woman who had decided months ago that she would not break in a room where her children were arriving. Deborah stayed as long as they allowed her, holding Amelia's hand until the surgical team moved in. She sat in the waiting room after that with her coat still on and her phone clutched in both hands, and she prayed in the way people pray, when they mean every word. The triplets arrived in a span of 11 minutes. 2 boys and a girl. All 3 screaming. All 3 perfect. And then, in the space between one monitor reading and the next, something shifted in Amelia's body. The numbers changed. The room changed. The quality of the nurse's movements changed in that specific way that communicates emergency without using the word. The doctors worked for a long time, and when they came out to the waiting area, it was with the particular gravity of people preparing to deliver news that will restructure someone's world. The attending physician, a calm, precise woman named Dr. Nadiose had been trying to reach Amelia's husband since 7 in the morning. He had not answered. She had reached Victor Thompson, listed as a secondary emergency contact, because Amelia was her father's daughter and planned the things she hoped would never happen at 7:44. Victor had been on a plane from San Francisco, already redirected the moment his phone rang, already moving with the controlled terror of a man who has learned to act before he allows himself to feel. He was 20 minutes away when Ethan Calloway finally walked through the doors. Dr. Osei met him in the corridor outside the maternity ward. She was direct. She had learned over 20 years of practice that softening certain sentences only extended suffering without reducing it. Mr. Calloway, your wife lost significant blood volume during delivery. She became unresponsive approximately 40 minutes ago. We've been working to stabilize her. The situation is serious. Ethan looked at her. Something moved across his face. Later, when people tried to describe it, the nurses who were nearby, an orderly who would pause in the hall, they would all use different words but arrive at the same place. It wasn't grief. It wasn't fear. It was something closer to calculation. The brief, visible processing of new information and what it meant for an existing plan. It lasted less than 2 seconds. Then the performance began. His face collapsed. His hand went to the corridor wall. He made the sound of a man receiving devastating news, and he made them well enough that the nurse closest to him instinctively reached out and touched his arm. The babies, he managed. All 3 are healthy, Dr. Osei told him. They're in the NICU as a precaution, but their vitals are strong. He nodded. He pressed his hand to his mouth. He let the nurse guide him to a chair, and he sat in it, and he performed grief with the fluency of a man who had spent years perfecting the performance of emotions he wasn't quite feeling. Rachel Voss stood 12 feet away, near the corridor wall, watching him with the particular expression of a woman trying to determine when it would be appropriate to step forward. 2 nurses exchanged a look. Neither of them said anything yet. They gave him a private room. This is the part that requires you to hold something in your mind, the specific mechanics of what followed, because the details matter. The details are what made what came next so complete, so documented, so impossible to walk back from. The room they gave him was room 412. It was where Amelia had been moved after the delivery team had done everything available to them. She was connected to monitors. Her vitals were being tracked by sensors whose readings appeared on screens both in the room and at the nurse's station down the hall. Dr. Osei stood in the doorway and said, with the gravity of someone choosing words carefully, "She's unresponsive. We're monitoring for changes. You can have some time." What Dr. Osei meant by time was a particular, painful kind of time that families are given in serious medical situations. Private time. Quiet time. What Ethan Calloway understood by time was something else. The room cleared. The door closed. He stood at the foot of the bed for a moment, looking at his wife, the woman who had taken a stranger's hand at a charity fundraiser and decided, against every warning, to build a life around him, who had given him a career, a home, a network, a future, who had carried 3 of his children through 9 months of his neglect and delivered them in a hospital he couldn't be bothered to rush to. He looked at her for a moment. Then he turned and opened the door and gestured for Rachel. She slipped into the room quietly, the way a person moves when they understand they are doing something that requires quiet. He closed the door behind her, and then, in room 412 of Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, with Amelia Thompson Calloway 4 feet away and the monitors tracking her every vital sign, Ethan Calloway pulled Rachel Voss into an embrace and said, with a brightness in his voice that had not been there 60 seconds earlier, "Yes, finally. Now I can finally live my life." He kissed her, not briefly, not the restrained contact of 2 people conscious of their surroundings. He kissed her the way a man kisses someone when he believes there is no longer any reason for restraint. What neither of them had noticed, what the relief of the moment had made them careless about, was a small, rectangular truth sitting in the corner of the room, a phone belonging to a nurse named Dominique Reyes, who had been in the room completing a final documentation check when the door opened, who had moved instinctively to the corner to give the grieving husband space, who had then become very still when she understood that what was happening in front of her was not grief. Dominique Reyes was 31 years old. She had been a nurse for 6 years. She had seen many things in those 6 years that she had processed and filed and carried professionally. She had never seen anything like this. Her phone was already in her hand. She'd been updating a patient note. Her thumb moved to the camera with the automatic instinct of someone witnessing something that needs to be witnessed correctly. She pressed record. She stood very still. And she documented 43 seconds of Ethan Calloway celebrating in the room of the wife he believed was dead. The voice came from the doorway. Deep, controlled. The voice of a man who has spent 30 years building things and has therefore learned exactly how to dismantle them. Congratulations, Ethan. The room went cold. Ethan and Rachel separated with a sudden, jerking motion of people touched by electricity. He turned. Victor Thompson stood in the doorway of room 412. He was 61 years old, silver-haired, dressed in the dark suit he'd been wearing when he boarded his redirected flight from San Francisco. He looked like what he was, a man of absolute consequence, and he looked at his son-in-law with an expression that was not anger. Anger would have been easier. What Victor Thompson wore on his face in that moment was something colder and more permanent than anger. It was the expression of a man whose worst assessment of another person has just been confirmed beyond any possible revision, and who has already, in the span of a corridor walk, begun to act on that confirmation. Behind him stood 2 men in dark suits who were not family members and were not hospital staff. They were attorneys. Specifically, they were the senior partners of Hartwell and Cross, the firm that had represented Thompson Capital Group for 19 years. The firm that knew exactly where every asset was held, every account maintained, every legal structure arranged. They had been called from the car. Victor stepped fully into the room. You finally got what you wanted. His voice was even, precise, the voice of verdict. Unfortunately for you, everything belongs to her. Rachel Voss took one step backward toward the wall. Effective as of 20 minutes ago, Victor continued, not raising his voice by a single degree, every account you have access to through your marriage to my daughter has been frozen pending legal review. Your position at Thompson Capital has been terminated. The Pacific Palisades property remains in Amelia's name, as it always has been. You have no claim to it. He paused. You have no claim to anything. Ethan Calloway's face had gone through several changes in rapid succession. The shock of being caught, the scramble for an explanation, the brief, desperate search for an exit, and had arrived, finally, at something pale and very still. Rachel Voss was already moving, not toward Ethan, toward the door. The calculation in her eyes was almost admirable in its speed. She had surveyed the room, assessed the situation, priced what loyalty to Ethan Calloway was currently worth, and reached a conclusion in approximately 4 seconds. She slipped past one of the attorneys with a murmured excuse and was in the corridor before anyone spoke again. Ethan watched her go, and then the monitors changed. It started as a single shift in a number, a change in heart rate, then blood pressure, then the specific sequence of readings that Dr. Osei had been watching for from the nurse's station down the hall, the sequence that meant the intervention had worked, that the body had decided to come back, that the crisis had passed in the direction of survival instead of the other one. The monitors began to beat with new urgency, the kind of urgency that summons people toward a room rather than away from it. Dr. Osei was through the door in 40 seconds with 2 nurses behind her. They moved to Amelia's side with the focused efficiency of a team that had been waiting for exactly this signal. Numbers climbed. Readings stabilized. The quality of a room changed the way rooms change when the outcome revises itself. Dr. Osei leaned close. Mrs. Calloway, can you hear me? If you can hear me, I need you to open her eyes. A long moment. The monitors held. And then Amelia Thompson Calloway opened her eyes. Not slowly, the way people open their eyes in films, not with cinematic reluctance, not as if emerging from a dream. Directly, fully, she opened her eyes the way she had always entered rooms, with complete presence, as if she had been there all along and was simply choosing now to make it visible. She looked at the ceiling first, then at Dr. Osei. Then, with the precise and unhurried rotation of a woman who had not lost her sense of direction, she turned her head and looked at her husband, at the 2 attorneys, at her father, at the empty space where Rachel Voss had been standing. Ethan Calloway was standing at the foot of the bed. He was the color of something that had never been warm. For a long moment, nobody spoke. And in that silence, something shifted permanently. Not in the room, in the architecture of what was possible. Some reversals can be recovered from. Some confrontations can be explained or reframed or survived with enough cleverness and enough time. This one could not. Amelia looked at her husband with the clear, steady gaze of a woman who had spent years extending grace to someone who had spent those same years treating grace as a renewable resource that cost him nothing to consume. She looked at him the way you look at something you have finally, fully seen. She said nothing. She didn't have to. What Ethan Calloway didn't know, what he had no way of knowing, because it had been arranged in the spaces he didn't have access to, was that Amelia Thompson had not arrived at this hospital unprepared. This is where the story becomes something different than what he thought he was living inside. Because Amelia, in those last months of her pregnancy, had not simply been decorating a nursery and talking to her unborn children and hoping that her husband was becoming the man she'd forgiven him for failing to be. She had been thinking. She was, as we have established, her father's daughter. And her father had not built a 30-year empire by waiting for people to reveal themselves. He had built it by preparing for what the evidence was already suggesting. In August, Amelia had had a quiet conversation with a private investigator named Carol Finch, a former federal agent, recommended by the family's legal team, known for his discretion and the particular thoroughness that comes from decades of doing this work for people who cannot afford incomplete information. She had given Carol Finch one instruction. Tell me everything. Not what you think I want to hear. Everything. What Carol Finch delivered to her 6 weeks later, in a secure file that she reviewed alone in her father's study, while Ethan was at a work dinner that wasn't entirely a work dinner, was everything. The timeline of the affair with Rachel Voss, not paused after his tearful confession, but restructured, moved to different locations, paid for through a method he believed was untraceable but wasn't. Hotel receipts, restaurant charges, a weekend in Napa registered under Rachel's name, but paid for with a card linked to an account Amelia had found no record of, because it opened it specifically for this purpose, which was its own kind of planning. Text messages, legally obtained, that documented not just an affair, but a conversation. A long, ongoing conversation between two people discussing a future that was scheduled to begin after a certain event made it possible. The event they were discussing was Amelia's delivery. They had been planning for what came after, not in vague terms, in specific ones. Carol Finch had included in the file a legal assessment prepared by the Hartwell and Cross team at Victor's request, a complete accounting of every asset in the marriage, every account, every property, and the exact legal standing of each. The Pacific Palisades house, purchased in Amelia's name before the marriage, remained entirely hers. The Thompson capital position, never converted to permanent employment through the HR process Ethan had never bothered to complete, was contractually terminable without severance. The accounts he believed were joint had a structure that allowed for emergency freezing under conditions of demonstrated fraud. Every door he thought he had access to had a lock she held the key to. She had just been waiting for the moment when there was no ambiguity, no room for revision, no version of events in which the thing that had been done to her could be explained as anything other than exactly what it was. He had given her that moment. In room 412, in 43 seconds of footage that Dominique Reyes had already, by the time Amelia opened her eyes, sent to 3 separate secure locations. The legal process was not dramatic in the way that films make legal processes appear. It was thorough. The Hartwell and Cross team filed the following week. The grounds were extensive, carefully documented, and in several areas crossed from civil into territory that the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office found worth reviewing, specifically the financial structures Ethan had constructed using access gained through his employment at Thompson Capital, access that had been used in ways that his employment agreement explicitly prohibited. That review became an investigation. The investigation moved quietly at first, then less quietly. Ethan Calloway, who had arrived at the hospital that Thursday morning as the husband of a billionaire's daughter with a corner office and a Pacific Palisades address, and a plan for his future, began to understand over the following weeks the precise dimensions of what he had walked into, not a betrayal caught in progress. A net that had been assembled, tested, and laid with patience, and that he had stepped into at the exact moment of his maximum arrogance, in front of witnesses, on camera, with attorneys already positioned at the door. His own attorney, retained hastily, paid for what money he was rapidly running out of, reviewed the documentation, and told to a professional candor that there were very few favorable positions available to him. There were none, actually, but the attorney was being kind. Loretta Calloway called her son 4 times the week the story broke. The first call was to ask what was happening. The second was to tell him she was sure there was an explanation. The third was to say that she was getting calls from people, and it was becoming uncomfortable. She did not make a fourth call. She had, by then, given a brief statement to a reporter from the Los Angeles Times. One of the reporters who had obtained a portion of Dominique Reyes's footage through a source at the hospital and had been making calls all week, in which she described herself as shocked and heartbroken and in no way aware of her son's behavior. She did not mention the years of pushing, the wedding she had engineered, the debt that Amelia had quietly paid. People rarely narrate their own complicity when the alternative is available. Rachel Voss resigned from Thompson Capital Group the same day the footage became public. She did not release a statement. She did not respond to 11 text messages Ethan sent her in the 24 hours following the hospital. She had made her calculation in room 412 in 4 seconds, and she had been consistent with it ever since. This is its own kind of character. Amelia spent 9 days in Cedars-Sinai. The medical team was cautious, thorough, and ultimately pleased. She healed with the same focused efficiency she applied to everything else. She had visitors, her father, who sat with her for hours saying less than she expected and meaning more. Conrad and his wife, the latter of whom said very little and looked, for the first time in Amelia's memory, genuinely chastened. Priya, who arrived on day 2 with food from the restaurant where they'd had that lunch at Nobu and sat on the edge of the hospital bed and didn't say, "I told you so" once, which was the most loving thing she could have done. Amelia held her children, all 3 of them, in the ways that the NICU team permitted, and then in the ways that a mother permits when her children are finally fully hers, in the uncomplicated, unhurried way of someone who has removed the thing from her life that was making everything complicated and hurried. She named them on day 4. She had chosen the names months earlier, alone in the nursery with the mural of the California coast. She hadn't shared them with Ethan. She hadn't been able to explain why at the time. She understood why now. He came to the hospital on day 7. He stood outside the main entrance for 40 minutes, which 2 hospital security staff noted and one of them photographed, before she was informed he was there. She sent a message through the Hartwell and Cross Teams liaison. The message contained 3 sentences. The first informed him that a restraining order was being processed and would be in effect within 48 hours. The second directed him to communicate exclusively through legal counsel from this point forward. The third informed him that his children would be raised knowing exactly who their father had chosen to be. He stood outside the hospital for another 20 minutes after receiving the message. Then he left. The footage from room 412 was viewed, by the end of the first week, by an audience that the outlets reporting on it described variously as massive, viral, and unprecedented for a story of this kind. People watched it with the particular fascination of witnessing something that confirmed a fear they've always held about what certain people are capable of. They watched the embrace. They watched the ease of it. The comfort of 2 people who had been waiting a long time for permission. They watched the 43 seconds and they felt, in a specific way that genuine injustice generates feeling when it's visible, a collective and escalating anger. And then they watched the door open. And they watched Victor Thompson step through it. And they watched, in the last 11 seconds of the footage, as the architecture of Ethan Calloway's plan became visible at exactly the moment it became rubble. The comment sections were extensive. They did not require summarization. Amelia Thompson Calloway was discharged on a Tuesday morning. She left through a side entrance at her father's suggestion, not because she was hiding, but because she had 3 infants and a recovery to manage and very little interest in performing her exit for anyone's benefit. Victor walked beside her. Priya carried the smallest of the 3 car seats with the focused care of someone who has been given an important assignment and takes it seriously. The Pacific Palisades house was hers. The nursery with the mural of the California coast was waiting. 3 cribs, positioned like a conversation. She had been right about that room. She had been right, in the end, about more than anyone who had seen only the forgiving, generous, open-hearted version of Amelia Thompson Calloway would have predicted. Because here's the thing about people who are genuinely intelligent and genuinely kind. They are often mistaken for people who can be taken advantage of indefinitely. The mistake is understandable. It is also, as Ethan Calloway was in the process of learning through every available channel, legal, financial, professional, and deeply personal, very, very costly. The investigation by the district attorney's office concluded 4 months later. The findings were specific, documented, and sufficient. The charges were filed on a Wednesday. Ethan Calloway learned about them through his attorney, who called him at 8 in the morning while he was in the Inglewood apartment he had moved back into, his mother's complex, the one Amelia had quietly paid off 2 years earlier, the address he had left with such certainty and returned to with none. He sat on the edge of the bed in a room that smelled like the life he'd been so certain he was done with. He thought about a charity fundraiser, a woman across a room, a first smile. He thought about everything she had handed him. And he thought, with the particular clarity that arrives only after there is nothing left to protect, about every single moment at which he could have chosen differently. There were many of them. He had not taken a single one. 3,000 miles away, Amelia put her daughter down in the crib by the window, the one with a view of the canyon, and stood in the yellow-walled room with the mural of the California coast and listened to particular silence of 3 children sleeping. It was the most peaceful sound she had ever heard. She had fought for this. She had bled for this. She had forgiven things that didn't deserve forgiveness and survived things that were designed to break her and emerged on the other side of all of it with the only things that had ever actually mattered: 3 heartbeats and a future that belonged entirely to her. Some people build their revenge in a moment of rage. Amelia Thompson built hers over months of silence, patience, and the quiet, unshakable knowledge of exactly who she was. Ethan Calloway wanted her life. He lost his, and somewhere in a courtroom in Los Angeles, the gavel is still falling. If justice was served, and it was hit like and subscribe. Comment, she knew all along if you saw it coming. Comment, I never saw that coming. If you didn't, thank you for watching. She won, and she did it without losing herself.